Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. The defining feature of religion is belief in some sort of supernatural power. It is possible to have a religion without this, but it seems to never really happen. It is also possible that a completely natural belief will result in practices that resemble those found in religious circles, but this does not necessarily make such a belief truly religious. That lofty title has been reserved strictly for beliefs in something that goes beyond the normal domains of the natural. A further restriction on qualification for the term religious is that there be some element of worship of a supernatural power. In other words, belief in one's own supposed supernatural powers or those of somebody else might not qualify. Neither would belief in a deity with no resultant acts of devotion to that deity. While some may quibble with this second requirement, it is widely agreed upon by those who tend to agree upon things such as this. This is a vital quality of religious beliefs, in that it almost invariably results in division among those who are otherwise all religious. It is possible for two groups or two individuals to believe in the same deity, but differ on the nature of the worship of that deity and find themselves mortal opponents. This is one of the unique pitfalls of religious beliefs. It tends to demand quite strict obedience. When it comes to monotheistic beliefs, this second requirement has become probably the greatest dividing point of contention. While all three believe in what is likely the same general idea of God, differences in the way they relate to that God and how they imagine that God to be have resulted in some of the deadliest wars in human history. Monotheistic religions tend to be extremely demanding of their particular path and very hesitant to allow for exceptions. They also tend to insist that their God demands this obedience and seeks vengeance on those who stand in the way. God is all too often associated with war and death, revenge and crusade. It almost seems as if this was a built-in requirement of monotheistic belief. The Bible, for better or worse, is no exception to this. If anything, it is the primary source for this idea. There is no shortage of verses associating God with war and vengeance, to say nothing of death to those who dare to challenge his plans. There is also little question that this was a primary driving force behind much of the fire and brimstone attitudes found in the Bible. Conquering and subjugation of other peoples and somewhat indiscriminate killing in God's name are not difficult to find in many places in the Bible. While the Jewish religion dropped much of this when the Jews went into exile and lost all sovereign power, Christianity and Islam adopted it full force when they attempted to spread their power over the world. It is something that many find distasteful about monotheistic religions and would like to see expunged. But it is there, and there it shall remain, as long as these religions remain faithful to their sacred texts. There is no getting around this, no matter how much we try. The only thing we can do is to mitigate its effects, if we so choose, or to try to understand why it had to be this way to begin with. Answering this question may explain a lot about monotheistic religions, but it also may confirm in the minds of those who are opposed to religion or monotheism that something is seriously wrong at the core. Nevertheless, it seems that the question needs answering. This week's Parsha is called Ha'azinu. That word means listen, and it introduces a verse that itself opens a long poem which takes up the bulk of the Parsha. This poem is called Parashat Ha'azinu, or the Ha'azinu song, since all biblical poems were called songs. The poem is rather long by biblical standards and isn't all that pleasant to read. It cuts no slack in its harsh warnings to the Israelites as to what will happen if and when they go against the teachings of the Torah. It begins by dramatically asking the heavens and the earth to listen to these words, for it claims to speak in the name of God. God is described as just and perfect in his ways of dealing with the world. Any fault found in those who claim to follow God is to be ascribed not to God, but to those frequently faithless followers. This is the general tenor of the entire poem. While it hints several times to the glorious beginnings of the Israelites, it tends to dwell on their inevitable failures that either happened or were destined to happen. There is a great deal of classic biblical wrath in this poem, directed either against the Israelites or their enemies. This poem closes on a note of promise of redemption, but it is not the much hoped for peaceful variety that can be found elsewhere in the Bible. It closes on a reminder of the absolute power of God and on the ultimate vengeance that will be exacted upon those who oppose him. This is not feel-good spirituality. The closing verses of the parsha following the poem reinforce the serious nature of what was just said. Quote, "Pay close attention to all the words through which I warn you today, so that you will be able to instruct your children to keep all the words of this Torah carefully. It is not an empty teaching for you. It is your life, and with it you will long endure on the land which you are crossing the Jordan to occupy." A curious feature of the poem is that it seems to switch its voice from that of some human speaker, likely Moshe, to that of God. It does this about halfway through the poem and then seems to switch back and forth a couple of times until the end. In several verses, it is unclear who the speaker actually is, God or Moshe or some other person. It appears to have been deliberately written this way to reveal some sort of ambiguity in who is really voicing these words. Why this should be so is left unclear. In two of the verses around the transition from one voice to another, there appears a phrase that is not found anywhere else in the entire Bible. First, it describes the nation making offerings to, quote, demons or something on that order, who are, quote, non-gods. A few verses later, in what is clearly the voice of God speaking, it states, quote, "They are a generation which reverses itself and cannot be trusted. They provoked me with a non-God, angering me with their meaningless acts, and I will provoke them with a non-nation. I will anger them with the nation devoid of gratitude." This strange phrase, non-God, is obviously paralleled with the phrase non-nation. This is a direct consequence of faithlessness to God. They would be rejected by God as a non-nation or provoked through a non-nation. But this non-God phrase is fascinating. At first, it seemed to be some false deity to whom they mistakenly directed their worship. The second use, however, seems to be something that goes beyond classic pagan worship. It seems to suggest a much broader form of rejection of God. But it is unclear what this might be and what these, quote, meaningless acts which angered God actually were. Perhaps this non-God reference hints to any devotion towards anything other than God. After all, what is a non-God anyway? It is anything other than God. Meaningless acts might then be referring to any action which is directed towards anything other than God. While this might seem quite harsh and restrictive, it does fit in the general tenor of the poem. The poem grants virtually no room for deviance and allows little in the way of anything that veers from a strict God-related life. This, for better or worse, is the main theme of the Bible. It cuts very little in the way of religious slack. This alone says much about the general biblical attitude towards backsliders or rebels. It makes no effort whatsoever to accommodate those who are opposed in any way. On the contrary, those people are to be severely punished, whether they are members of the religion or not. This is a clear position of the Bible and of subsequent monotheistic religions. The all-or-nothing attitude towards anything other than devoting one's life to upholding the core beliefs of these religions is the hallmark of monotheism. It should come as no surprise that these religions took their beliefs so seriously and took such a harsh position to any opposition. But there is one other factor that may play a note in this harsh monotheistic attitude. This is much more controversial from a religious standpoint, but much more obvious from a secular standpoint. Religions almost invariably believe that their core beliefs come from a divine source. This is such an essential assumption that it hardly needs stating. But it is difficult to avoid the human element entering into anything as personal and as essential as belief. In fact, many would say that all belief is a product of the mind. It is not so easy to believe otherwise. When this other factor is taken into account, the question arises of how much of religious attitudes is really divine and how much is a product of human thought. While each religion clearly claims that their beliefs are the product of divine inspiration, the question still is there of how much human input was needed to achieve the ultimate result. This is obviously a sticky question for monotheistic religions. Judaism, while clearly asserting a major component of divine inspiration in its core beliefs, has no problem admitting that the human element played a major role in shaping the ultimate outcome. Rabbinic Judaism is entirely a product of human thought. Even something as primary as the Bible was shaped significantly by human thought. Perhaps this poem Ha'azinu is an example of that. The deliberate obscuring of which parts are human voice and which are divine very possibly suggests that this line wasn't as clearly delineated as many have commonly assumed. Who really knows where to draw that line? Perhaps this harsh attitude towards opposition cannot really be attributed solely to God. Perhaps there is a human element that pushes its own very human attitude into the words and the ideas. There is no question that many would place such a suggestion beyond the pale. They do this for the noble reason of keeping the most sacred text purely divine. But that mixture of human and divine voice might suggest otherwise. It also might provide a bit of relief for those who are bothered by the revenge-oriented tenor of this poem and the Bible in general. Perhaps recognition of this debatable element is needed to understand what the Bible really is and why it speaks in the harsh way that it does. This is an open-ended question that can only be answered by personal belief. What is yours? Shabbat Shalom.